Hey everybody, it's Smitty from Boron Extrication. Today we're going to go over some EMS and extrication stuff. The two really go hand in hand, and I'm going to explain a few little tidbits. We're going to jump around a little bit, but this quick video, you should get a few things out of it that are going to help your patients in the end. So what are we going to go over today? We're going to talk about some patient assessment and some care. We're going to talk about kinematics of the vehicular trauma. We're going to talk about that infamous mechanism of injury. And then we're going to talk about the weather. And the weather can play a pretty pivotal role in the outcome of our patient. So why are we there? What is the whole reason we are called to the scene? Oftentimes, we want to think that we're called there to cut apart a car, but we're really there to get our patient out of the vehicle. We are there for the patient. And a lot of times, extrication tends to get so focused on the tips, the techniques, the methods, the vehicle makeups, the new technology, and I'm just as guilty as the next person. I mean, I put a huge emphasis on new vehicle technology, but we are there for the patient, and that's what we got to remember. Everything we learn about the new vehicles, every technique we get to a mastery level is for the patient. So we'll talk about patient assessment. So, what is the level of care you're going to provide to your patient? Now, my department, we run a transporting BLS department. We have a few guys that are paramedics and certified for ALS, but when they're working for us, they are operating under a BLS license. We have a private outside company that also responds for ALS. But think about our patient and the assessment that we're going to do to them. As soon as we get there, the first thing that we want to do is we want to make contact with that patient. And if you've ever witnessed or been to a extrication competition, the first thing you're going to notice is that the guy that is assigned, our guy, the rescuer that's assigned to patient care, approaches the front of the vehicle to get the occupant, the driver, the passenger, or both of them, one or the other, get their attention while they're looking straight ahead. And this is so they don't make any sudden turns of their head. You approach from the front of the vehicle and immediately tell them what's going to start happening. Hey, I'm here. I'm going to be coming inside there. I'm going to be assessing your medical needs. You're going to start hearing some things going around you. Please don't look at them. Keep your head focused straight ahead for me. I don't want you to turn your neck, turn your head. And as you make that contact, what that does is now you've got a start of a relationship with that patient, and you can focus only on them while the rest of your crew is gearing up for the extrication. Now, no one wants to be that inside guy, but that inside guy is pivotal because the inside person is going to give their assessment of the condition of the patient. And that's going to dictate several things. The speed of the extrication, and then how we're going to transport that patient. Are we going to need to call for an air ambulance? A lot of times you can get on scene and the crash is bad enough that you call for a chopper right away. There's nothing wrong with that. You can always cancel them. You can always turn them away. In Michigan, a lot of times our weather is dependent if the air ambulances are actually flying that day. So sometimes that leads us into an extended transport if we don't have favorable weather conditions like snow. It will take longer for our ground ambulance to get there, and then the air ambulance may not be flying that day. The big thing to consider is all of our patients need BLS. We're going to do the ABCs, airway, breathing, circulation. Spinal stabilization. Now, this is a subject that you could go off on another tangent. In Oakland County, where my department is located, we've just adopted, I think at the beginning of this year, the new spinal stabilization protocols where we don't have to backboard everybody like we've been doing. But you want to take precautions. That doesn't mean you have to collar board them every time. Simply getting your patient to not move their head. You can put that collar on them, and that is used to remind them not to move their head. And then we're going to want bleeding control. If we've got any severe injuries, we're going to want to control that bleeding. And then if we need O2, we can give that to our patient as well. Depending on how you're set up, if you are a ALS fire department, you're probably going to have your rescue there or your ambulance that can transport the patient. If you don't, and ALS, a private company, isn't automatically dispatched the same time you are, you'd want to make sure you get those guys rolling. And then we talked briefly about what we're going to do for transport. It's going to be ground or air. And if we do call for that chopper, we've got to be thinking of a few other things. Where are we going to land that chopper? Do you have a pre-designated landing zone in your city? Do you have one or two? And are those locations going to work the best for you? Or should you close down a parking lot or close down a stretch of highway? Those are things you're going to have to consider. And you can always call on mutual aid departments to set up an LZ for you. That's something I've seen done, and it's not a bad way to manage your resources, especially if you're shorthanded. So kinematics of vehicular trauma. We're going to talk a little bit about the trauma, and we're going to dive into a couple little areas that hopefully you guys will take away something from it. So we got the first collision, right? And that's the vehicle impacting another vehicle or an object. We got the second collision. Occupants impact an interior part of the vehicle if they're unrestrained, that type of thing. Whiplash, you could be belted, and the movement from the belt slack and the seat is enough to give you whiplash. We talked about some of the anti-whiplash stuff in the new vehicle technology. That stuff's out there that's helping, but we're still going to run into whiplash cases. The third collision, the occupant organs strike other organs, or the cavity, the brain hitting the skull, that type of thing. We're going to dive in just a little deeper after we get through these four collisions here. And the fourth collision is occupants can be struck with unrestrained items or other passengers that aren't restrained in the vehicle. I mean, think about if you have a backpack in your car. Are you going home from the store and you purchased an item that you just set on the rear seat or you set on the front seat and it's heavy? That's not restrained and you get in an accident. That object could become something that you impact while you're in the vehicle. It could be moved over towards you. There's a lot of things that could happen. So these things you want to assess the patients to determine where they fall into these. Now, I told you we're going to talk about the infamous mechanism of injury. This is something that is common with whiplash accidents. It's the worst is the coup contra coup. But the coup is damage to the brain at the point where it impacted, where you got hit in the head. That would be localized. The contra coup injury is damage to the brain on the side opposite to the side that received the initial impact or blow. Now, whiplash is where the coup contra coup injury comes into play. And that's damage to the brain on both sides. The side that received the impact and the opposite side's initial impact. And this is a picture that kind of shows how this reacts. You can see the back of the brain impacting the skull here. The front of the brain impacting the skull here. So this would be where you get the coup contra coup injury. So these are the different collisions that you will run into. And you can have collisions like we talked about of organs bouncing off other parts of the anatomy inside of your patient. There's a lot of things we talk about when you're trying to determine some mechanism of injury. We talk about looking for starred windshields. We got to make sure, was that caused by a head hitting the windshield, or was it caused by one of the airbags? Typically, where I've seen a starred windshield, or the windshield actually penetrated, if it was from a person's head, there's typically some hair and a little bit of skin that's embedded into that glass. So that'd be a good indication that your patient wasn't restrained. And you should be able to easily see that on his head when you start your assessment. Look for the steering wheel to be bent or deformed. Were they sitting too close to that steering wheel? We talked about car seats have a occupant sensor. And what that is it actually weighs the person sitting on the seat and determines if they weigh enough to deploy the airbag. Well, they also have one that's a positioning sensor. And if the driver, let's say, is too close to the steering wheel, it will not deploy the airbag. So these are some of the things that we're going to look for. So we could have something where we have a deformed steering wheel and the airbag did not go off. We want to look at the dashboard, check for knees, hip, leg injuries. Those are things we can see. If our patient's got a leg or a hip injury, they're going to be in a lot of pain. And then pedal damage. Did they get caught in the pedals? Did any injury happen from the pedals? The mechanism of injury also includes intrusion. How much did that passenger compartment get intruded by either the object or the other vehicle? We're going to look at the doors. We're going to look at even armrests, center consoles, anything that could cause an internal injury. Restraint devices, the lap shoulder belt restraints, those can cause injury. We talked about the pretensioners in the new vehicle technology video, and we hit on how it takes the slack out, and I showed you guys that video I posted, and it showed the aluminum can getting crushed by that pretensioner. So as that tightens up, the belt can cause injury to our patients. And then, did they get hurt by an airbag? We want to check our older and younger patients for these. And then we do know airbags can, on rare occasion, cause some abrasions, some very minor burns, but these are things we want to check for. Now here's where I'm going to dive off a little bit, and we're going to look at mechanism of injury for what we don't really look for, what we don't see. And let's take the seat, for instance. There's several schools of thought to how the best seat is designed. Some say it should be with a rigid back frame. Others say the whole seat system yields better and protects the occupant better. So it's a constantly evolving change. The seat system typically yields and absorbs a lot of the impact forces and distributes them into the car. So we can check that seat and we can see what it tells us. The first thing is, and this can be done after the patient's already moved out. Now, if it's got a power seat and you've already secured the 12 volt, you won't be able to move the adjuster forwards and backwards. But if it's a manual or if the power wasn't secured, you couldn't get to it, if that seat will move forward and backwards, there's a good chance that the force that the patient received wasn't that great. That's probably not going to be too big of an accident. You're not going to see a lot of the damage. And then what does the back frame look like? And we talk about the back frame. Does it look twisted? Or does it look like the seat is just reclined? Or does something just not look right on it? And the reason I bring this up is several things can happen. Some seats have an anti-whiplash feature that actually will let the back frame cushion the occupant during a crash. And Volvo's got one, I believe, that's got a link that snaps and allows the seat back to move back. But other times, if you notice the seat is reclined further than normal, you'd want to investigate just a little bit to see, is that seat structure compromised? Is it twisted? Is it bent? Because if the seat's reclined a lot, that's an indication that that seat back absorbed a lot of the load from the patient. One thing we don't normally look for is after the patient's out, and these are all things can be done real quick after the patient's being packaged on the cot. One guy can just do these things. Take a look at these items. Is you can look at the floor pan and where the seat is mounted. You can look for any deformation of the vehicle floor from that seat moving and accepting the loads from the patient. And we're going to look at where the seat mounts to the floor. And in one of the tips and techniques videos, I talked about how these are very strong parts of the seat and that you can use them to push a ram off of. So these are what we're going to look for. Is that floor pan, did it pull away? Can you see that metal compromised a little bit? And that's another thing that's going to tell you that our patient was in a pretty substantial accident. Another thing about mechanism of injury is think of a vehicle that bounces forward. Say a vehicle hits another one. The guy had it in neutral, barely had his foot on the brake. So when he got hit, the vehicle bounced. And a lot of older cars were built this way. They didn't have the crumple zones in them, so they would bounce off each other. When that happens, those forces are transferred to the occupant. And cars nowadays, they have a lot of the crumple zones, and those help protect the occupant and keep the force distributed into the vehicle structure. This is something just to keep an eye out, that if you have an accident where the vehicle that got hit has very little damage, but the other vehicle has a lot of damage, there's a good chance that some sort of bouncing happened. The vehicle that got hit didn't absorb all of the forces that it should have. All right, weather. Now this is one I really like to talk about. I live in Michigan, right outside Detroit. So we get our fair share of nasty winter weather. Most of the Great Lakes don't get above 60 very much during the summer. But what's one thing we probably never think about during an extrication? Is our patient hypothermic? I've seen studies, I've read a lot of articles that talk about this. The estimate, I've seen anywhere from 50 to like 65, 70% of trauma patients arrive at the emergency room with hypothermia. Now, if you think about that, a trauma patient that has hypothermia, that is not a good thing at all. And a lot of times, I believe that we are responsible for that happening. And you think to yourself, well, how could this happen? You could imagine on a snowy, cold night, it's 5 degrees outside, wind chill, -20. You might assume there's a good chance that our patient may be hypothermic. What I like to talk about is when I travel long distances, I like to take off my winter coat. I usually like to wear a short sleeve shirt, and then I've just got the heat on in the car. Well, what happens? I get in an accident and one of my windows breaks out. And let's say I damage the coolant system in the car, so now the engine's not running. Am I going to have heat for very long? So think about your response time and how long it takes you to get to the patient during the winter, during inclement weather. Your response time is going to be a little greater. And then how long did it take for the call to be placed? Because we all know that the time of call isn't necessarily the time the accident happened. It could be that's the first person who was able to call 911 called it in. So we should start thinking about how can we prevent hypothermia in our trauma patients during an extrication. We talked about the weather exposure causing it. But what do we do as soon as we get them in the back of the rig? We cut all their clothes off to do the proper trauma assessment. And there's nothing wrong with doing that trauma assessment. But did we ever think that we should cover the patient with the blanket and section by section do the trauma assessment so we don't have the patient laying there, even if it's for a minute or two, totally unclothed? And how warm is that ambulance? If you've had the back doors open, you've got the heater kicking, but how long is it going to take that part of the ambulance to get to your average room temperature? And what is your average room temperature? It's a lot lower than where hypothermia starts. So there's a few things we can do, and we can do them on scene to help protect our patients. One of the big things we carry is the Ready Heat. They're disposable. Soon as you open them, they start to heat up, and you can cover your patient with that. And the best thing is, now your patient's covered. You've protected him from glass. You've protected him from the weather. And you've actually got something that is going to keep his body temperature above hypothermic levels. And if he is at hypothermic levels, you can start the warming process with these. The ALS company that we run with, they have these pizza delivery box warmers is basically what they are. But there's blankets in there, and they keep the blankets warm and basically do the same thing as these Ready Heats. What I like about the Ready Heats is you just open them up, use them once, they're throwaway. Something else to think about, if you're going to be on an extended extrication, let's just say everything you're trying isn't going right, or you have to move several vehicles to get to the patient. Say it's a really bad pileup. If you're going to be there for a long while, is it possible to provide heat into that vehicle? Well, you can use a confined space heater. Basically runs off propane. You may not have it on your rig. It may be something that's on like a tech rescue trailer or a tech rescue truck, something that deals with confined space. But if you think about it, that's always an option. But when do you want to decide that's an option? When you're faced with it, or well before that? So it's just something to keep in mind, and something to kind of turn a little light bulb on, that we do need to think outside of the box for a lot of this stuff. What we can do during our extrication, there's a couple things we can do. This vehicle here is Pack-Ax Smash. It's basically a film that's sticky, put it over the glass, and it basically laminates the glass. But the other option you can do is, if the window's already broken out, you can cover up the opening with Pack-Ax. And now you have shielded the patient from the elements. Something to consider. Over here, this is the Genesis tool dealer in Michigan. He's a deputy chief in Grand Rapids on the west side of the state. Chief Solmeyer. He showed me this technique. It's called the cold weather lift. And what they train on this is, you've got a patient that has leg entrapment. So they're going to have to do a dash lift or a dash roll. So what they do is, they make these cuts you see here. They make the standard cut at the bottom of the A-pillar. They compromise the reinforcement behind the front fender. And then they make a cut on the B-pillar and then a cut on the C-pillar. And then they take the glass as the last step. So the patient is still shielded from the weather to some extent. You still got the windshield, and you still have both of your windows there. And something else I like about this is, it's a low manpower thing. You're not taking the roof off, so you don't need the personnel to safely move the roof from the patient. One thing when you guys are training in extrication and you're doing hands-on, always treat it as if there is an occupant in every seat inside of that vehicle. You don't want to drop a roof on a person. You always want to train like there's someone there, because you're going to revert back to your training when you're in a stressful situation. So with that, I'd like to thank you guys all for taking this class. I hope you picked up a few things, and I hope it was worth your time and worth the money. I really plan to improve this program over the few years. I'd like to get some outside instructors and get different areas of extrication covered and try to present it in a online format like this so we can network with people from around the world, and we can also get training on our schedule when it's convenient, and then we can use scheduled training time to do the hands-on stuff. Because with the video and the online, our brothers and sisters can take that training when it is convenient to them. So once again, guys and gals, thanks again. And I'll leave you with what I have on the back of all my challenge coins. And it is, knowledge is only powerful if you share it. Don't ever think holding one little nugget is going to be your ticket to, say, speaking at FDIC or getting the promotion. You're going to be successful when you share that information. So everybody be safe and take care.